Hi everybody. Hope everybody's having a good week. I'm Jordan Fink, the executive director of BuildSoil, which is a nonprofit focused on finding community solutions for climate change and helping people get together around things that we can do that will help us understand our ecology, be better connected to our place, and of course, we're starting with a large project to get 1 million chestnut trees planted for food and climate. And I've begun to start streaming just as a way of replacing the pre-pandemic methods that we used to have of going and talking to people directly. It's been so nice, all the positive feedback that we've been getting from the last week of presentations that we did, and you can see on our Twitch stream as well as our YouTube channel, BuildSoil. And we should be putting out more content and more regular classes. But for now, I'm just getting familiar with the technology and trying out different things and reviewing stuff that I've made before. Today, I'm going to be focusing on some threads that I did about 2 years ago that were explorations of different patterns and principles in permaculture design. Now, you may hear the term permaculture a lot, but the basic deal with permaculture is that in the early 80s, an ecologist and researcher named Bill Mollison found that his student, David Holmgren, was applying some of the classroom concepts in his yard. They'd been studying ecology, they'd been studying anthropology, and they'd been working closely with indigenous communities. And they started realizing that they could be building ecologies at home. So they started coming up with some ways of applying ecosystem design to place, and that just began this entire movement of permaculture. Now, a lot of people talk about permaculture as if it is something special and unique. What's special and unique is that it has a curriculum, and that curriculum is rooted in ethics. I'm sorry, just 1 second. I'm going to pause and I'll be right back. Apologies for that. There was an alarm going off. Having to still learn what has to get turned on and off. So, permaculture is unique in that it actually is a set curriculum, and that curriculum is rooted in prior ecological design methodologies, but it allows for the rapid teaching of some basic principles so that people can make good design decisions in the future. Its original intent was the observation that international aid has often imposed Western models of landscape planning onto often indigenous and often communities that are indebted to global systems of loan and debt. So permaculture was conceived of as a way of honoring and upholding indigenous knowledge, and not as a way of claiming superiority or a specific attitude onto those communities. Instead, it was meant to be helping rapid fire bring together the world's knowledge as quick as possible so that communities could act. And in a lot of ways, permaculture's greatest successes are in the global south. They are not in North America and Australia, which were the places it really started, because it has been taken on by local communities and has had a life of its own. So the basic fundamentals of the design curriculum are what I tend to hold to when I'm involved in permaculture. I don't look at a garden and say, that's a permaculture garden. But I may look at a person and say, okay, that person has gone through a curriculum that's helped them get there. Because a lot of people may look at a permaculture garden and say, that's exactly how my grandmother gardened. How can you call that permaculture? And I wouldn't. I would say that your grandmother was doing it right, and that permaculture is a way to get the rest of us to get anything close to that. So permaculture itself is the study of permanence. And there are many ways that people have achieved and explored permanence on this planet. And often we have to look to examples that are not the rapid fire colonialism of our current system. So the basic principles, though, are a shorthand. They're a way of thinking quickly about complex systems and moving forward from there. I have a friend who, years ago, when he was in the beginning of his permaculture design career and has moved on to a lot of cool things since, he started writing these principles down on note cards. And every day he'd pick one principle and he would spend the rest of the day exploring that question, that design parameter, while he was looking at the world around him. And so I thought about 2 years ago, when I was trying to figure out how to use Twitter as a space to communicate and teach, I was like, let's just pick a principle a day and explore it. Look at some of the avenues, look at some of the ways that it's expressed. These principles are derived from observation of nature. They are not necessarily real, right? They're cultural constructs that help a lot of us see the world and make better decisions. And they can be applied to social contexts, personal contexts, environmental contexts. But mostly they are sayings that help us reshape our perspectives. And good stories, good myths, good memes are all things that also do this for us. And so the principles are just a starting point. I'm not personally attached to them, but I do enjoy them as a way of beginning to think about some of these things. So I intend to go through some of these Twitter threads, and we have an open chat, and we've got a bunch of people here with us. So I'm going to start reading through them and talking about them as we go. And if there's questions or thoughts, we can explore those as well. As always, I'm very grateful for everybody's time and attention here. And more, I'm going to be trying to figure out how to best use Twitch and YouTube and our Discord in order to have multiple voices and other people's perspectives, so it isn't just me talking. But for now, I'm getting used to it. Joel's here saying hi as I start. Thanks, Joel. Now, if anybody wants to, you're always welcome to donate. We are a nonprofit, and we're trying to get 1 million trees planted. So please consider subscribing to the channel, which turns out on Twitch to give us a little bit of monthly cost coverage, which is nice. You're also welcome to join our Discord. I have a little QR code so that you can scan it with your phone if you want and join our Discord. We have now over 530 people who are all over the planet and forming groups and discussing how they're going to get trees and other things planted in their communities. And we also have movie nights and discussions. So I recommend it as an interactive space. I'm hoping to have a conference sometime soon where a lot of us can be face-to-face through that tool and begin the effort of planting a ton of trees and creating a lot of food supply over the next few years. So let's get started. So I thought I'd start with this one, which was the thread that really began my permaculture principle thread series. And it's some of these might be very simple. We'll see how they go. It's interesting reading something I wrote 2 years ago. So back in June, I'm going to choose a permaculture design principle a day for the month. In order to start, we center ourselves in the permaculture ethics that guide the principles, so that designs and lives are always serving the good. I'm excited to start. Ready to come along? So I'm not an ethicist, and I'm specifically talking about the values that give rise to these principles. So all of the permacultures in principle can be derived from these ethics. And I think that that's essential. So that's why I like this. So philosophy majors, love you, but be forgiving. And other permaculture teachers, wait and see where I'm going with this before you comment. I learned these from Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, who developed the permaculture curriculum in the 70s as a way to rapidly teach people who are disconnected from land or in a changing landscape. Oh, sorry, I'm still getting used to using this. Okay. Or in a changing landscape, how to design in ways that support people and ecosystems. So this is Bill Mollison, old Australian activist who decided that food supplies were the most important thing in order to support radical communities and communities in resistance. And he settled down and just started figuring this stuff out. And here's his student, David Holmgren, who's a bit of more of a back-to-lander and has his own philosophy of a lot of things. Both ecologists and activists just lived through the Australian government opposing the US wars in Southeast Asia, only to be overthrown in 1976. They were involved in environmental and other movements, and Mollison was teaching ecology and sociology, and Holmgren was attempting to apply Howard Odom's ideas to his yard. And again, permaculture has been expanded and used, and all the communities around the world who have taken on permaculture have added to it in ways that these two gentlemen could never have imagined. Openly learned and drew from ecological design movements, but especially from traditional ecological knowledge, which is a major problem in the permaculture movement. A major problem that I see in the permaculture movement is that they don't acknowledge that Mollison cited where his ideas came from. So what I've seen happen in this, and this is one of the biggest problems I see with the adaptation of traditional ecological knowledge without, is that you may have one generation of people who have asked permission and are citing their sources. So Mollison says every time he uses a piece of knowledge, this was knowledge that was given to me, and here's the context, and here's the people that use it, and here's when it's appropriate. But his students hardly ever do that. And I think that is the problem with that kind of teaching, is that open practices, they are open practices, but open practices get stripped of their contextual meaning very quickly. And that's, for me, the biggest criticism I would have of permaculture. Anyway, so mostly they saw the success of permaculture in helping movements and communities that had been pushed to the edges, and they both spent a lot of their careers helping people who had asked for help and needed it and tended to avoid the privileged. Not all in the movement have been so wise. And this feels like the right place to start when talking about ethics. We can have sustainable systems, but are they ethical? We can feed some of the people while oppressing others. How do we be ethical in a way that can center our focus and help us make decisions that move us forward? Okay, nerdy time. The dictionary says that ethics comes from ethos, right? Character and common values, related to the Sanskrit word svadha, which is habit or custom. That's what these are, general domains that inform how we prioritize things. So to quote Mollison's design manual, the prime directive of permaculture, the only ethical decision is to take responsibility for one's own existence and that of our children, and to make it now. A principle that we'll go over later is called cooperation over competition. And so the imperative when developing these ethics was, how do we ensure the most common cooperation possible? The most cooperation possible. In other words, how do we create peace? So I've written and talked about the work of Howard Odum before. So David Holmgren and I both see the potential in seeing ecology and society as the same system. So Howard Odum made these diagrams, and what they are is you read them from left to right. So you have sources, which are these circles, and the system is this square right here of, for example, a shifting agriculture. Here's the sun, here's rain, here's all the species, here's the geology, and those are the inputs into the system. A lot of the energy leaves, because it must at each stage, and sunlight bounces back, and it's not all captured. But of the sunlight that's captured, some of it goes into the forest, along with the rain, the species, and the geology. It stores soil nutrients and biomass. It transfers some of that and is burned into soil. Some of that light goes into the bananas and root crops in this system, which feed the people. The people then put energy of seed and labor and fire. And soil is recovered during abandoned land practices, fallow periods. And people leave and people go. So this is the complexity of a shifting agriculture system where people are burning regularly, the forest is developing, the people are transferring some of the nutrients but allowing soil to accumulate from the natural forests, and they're growing people, and the people are doing labor. So here I have simplified these systems into a general domain of ecosystems, society, and feedback systems. So trophic levels. The first here is that the earth itself, it takes on nutrients. It has all of these different cycles. There's a system of the earth. And within that, it supports a system of people and society. And when people are in proper relationship, they give back and support the earth's systems. So we can see these form a loop where a fecund world lives. People take from it, but they also give back to it. The only way to take responsibility for our existence and that of our children is to take care of these three domains. So in permaculture, officially, there are three ethics. 1 is care for the earth. 2 is care of people. And 3 is the limit of consumption and the redistribution of surpluses. And so this forms a full ethical system that we can go into details about. We can talk about how does one care for the earth? How does one care for people? And how does one then not consume too much, not grow too much, and then use that to take care of the whole again. This describes the flows of energy from sunlight into a healthy world, an order of operations. Look around. Are there systems that support us well? care for them. 2, take what grows and use it to take care of people. Make sure people are fed, sure people are housed, make sure people are clothed. And then with cared for people, we then help the world and others. And that loop can continue over time, just like it does in a complex ecosystems, making a better and better world as we go. The system of holistic management, which is another kind of land use system, has something similar that it uses to think about linking ecology, society, and economy, which it calls the chain of production, where sunlight becomes plants. In this area that we call resource conversion, sunlight becomes plants. Then product conversion, where plants become products. And then market conversion, where products are traded. They use this to ensure that repair goes to the weakest link. So for example, if you have a system where you have grasslands, cows or bison, and then some sort of processing of like marketing of that, at any given moment, there's a weak point. So maybe you don't need to be marketing more when you need to be taking care of your grass. Maybe you don't need to be taking care of the grass more when the weak link is the health of the cows. And so at any moment, your attention goes to the weakest link and strengthens the whole. That way you keep a whole system in mind. And the same thing could be said for these 3 ethics, that at any moment, the earth needs care, people need care, and our systems of mutual feedback need care. And so we can build those over time. I like to have these 2 models in mind, and they're a little different, but they both ask the same question, which is, at this moment, where does my attention go? What's the best use of my behavior? How do I act ethically? And they are processes of continually improving the whole. Hey, kid. So when we're acting, are we doing earth care? Is the soil interacting with plants? Is the sunlight being stored as biomass, clean water, diversity, insect habitat? Are we growing food for every living thing and helping things loop and improve? How are other living beings doing? That's the first question, right? How is the world? The second question is, how are we doing? How are we doing our care of people with the resources that we have? Is everyone fed, safe, respected, allowed to connect to their lives and needs? Are people healthy? Are they loved? How are their bodies doing? How are their brains? How are their hearts, their mindfulness, their mutual respect, their autonomy? Are past wrongs being mended? Is there justice? Right? These are all the considerations for ethical treatment of people. And are we taking the extra and giving a fair share? Another way to put this third ethic to those earth systems and people. Are surpluses being put to work in helping plants, planet, and people? It's supposed to be planet. So we will understand that improving weak links in this cycle will generate more and more well-being and health for everything and everyone. More and more sunlight and nutrients will cycle. Streams will start back up. Soil will build, and people will find more peace. Earth care and people care and feedbacks are all one and the same, right? They're all together. Species care, land care, soil care all grow from this. So permaculture gets over-associated with particular techniques, such as sheet mulching, which is layering of materials on ground in order to accumulate, to build soil. It's just one technique. It doesn't work everywhere. Keyhole beds, which are a very efficient way of minimizing paths so that you can walk into a single path and be surrounded by a garden bed. Food forests, which are a way of growing food that mimics a forest, but again is not the only technique and not the only approach and does not work in all contexts. But what the originators intended was that it be a way of going about applying these ethics to our lives and choosing actions that make the most sense in light of them. So, having searched and retrieved these ethics, we are prepared with a map that gives us the context for all of these other principles that we're going to talk about. Ways to think about application within these interconnected flows of earth and people. So thank you so much for joining me in this one on permaculture ethics. So that was one I did as a start. And I like starting with that question of ethics because if you don't root everything you're doing in that question of how do you take care of earth, people, and redistribution, everything gets distorted. You're not able to think clearly about why the rest of these principles are happening. If they're not being directed towards those issues, then what exactly are you doing? So again, thank you everybody who's joining. This is just me rambling about ethics today. But we'll talk about some other stuff. So the next one that I want to start with, I'm going to go through and bounce around with the principles a little bit today because some of them were a little bit drier than others. I just sort of went through it step by step. But I think I want to start with the one I did second here because this is an important one. So day 2 of the permaculture principles I did. The principles intersect. So just starting with this one, observation. And the principle is stated as use protracted and thoughtful observation of natural systems rather than protracted and thoughtless labor. So we take time, we observe, we wait. In a lot of contexts, this means you literally just wait a year. You want to see a full cycle. Maybe you wait much longer, or you step back and listen to the people who have had long-term observation. But whenever I'm on a piece of land or if I'm in a context, I try my best not to impose my own ideas on it, right? I go and I observe first. Because I might be wrong. I might have biases. Something may mimic something else. There's such a thing as, camouflage. There's such a thing as things with similar patterns but have opposite meanings. So this principle might be obvious, but people are always driving too quickly into naming problems or offering solutions. Just asking the question, what is occurring? And spending time to see many kinds of patterns is huge. One way I try to do this, and I've been taught to do this, is to separate the question of, what is and what does it mean? What, so what? Because my brain is always kicking up meaning when I observe things. Oh, the land is shaped like this. It means this. Oh, the people seem to be doing this. It means this. And that might actually be really wrong, right? So it's really important to say, what do I see? What do I observe? Like that is just like true based on observation, and separate from my interpretation. And there's nothing wrong with writing down interpretation, but that's not the same thing as observation. When you walk into the forest, the animals are aware of your presence. You create ripples of rings of effect out from your actions. The birds are noticing and they're changing their songs and position, and the other animals notice. You are not seeing the woods, you are seeing your own impact. I don't know how many times when I've walked through the forest, I see birds, but all of them are in the upper branches of trees, and they're all going psh, 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 psh. And what they're doing is they're getting high out of my reach, and they're making an alarm call to let the other birds know. And sometimes if I've been quiet in the forest, I may hear a wave of birds in the distance, psh, 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 letting me know that someone else is coming. And so if we're not careful, we will just see the birds reacting to ourselves, and we'll not even know what birds are like when they're calm, when they're good. We may walk through the forest and see a lot of animals, but we may just see the backs of deer as they run. And it's really hard to interact with other people without seeing only what you create, the waves that you put out into that. So we have to be really careful about not just living in our own wake. So this is true in science, in community organizing, in looking for your car keys. You are living within the sphere of your own influence. So Bill Mollison recommends the following. He says you need to have a childlike and non-selective approach. And you ask, I wonder why? Being curious. You can also have a thematic approach, which is breaking down things. I do this a lot. Water, land, birds, paths. Or I think in terms of climatic conditions, landform, water, vegetation, access and circulation, built environment and infrastructure, wildlife corridors, on and on, these different kinds of systems. You can have an instrumental approach, which is using measurements, equipment, and data collection. You can have an experiential approach. You can use your senses. So I recommend looking for patterns for what calls to you. But also become comfortable with noticing what you're avoiding. Like, what are you not looking at? What are your habitual patterns of which you don't notice? And why do patterns break or change is another important question. So in order to be somewhere and not be messing with the birds, you often have to get up early before the dawn chorus. There's this period of time right before dawn where the birds just all wake up and make a ton of noise, and they're establishing their habitat, or they're establishing their territories for the day. I'm here. Okay, I'm over here. I've got this branch. You guys can't come over here. And they call to each other. And then when it's finally daytime, they all get quiet again. And now they're just watching. If you can get out there before that point, then you have the ability to actually they build their network of the day, their communication network before, with you in mind. And so you're not going to be rushing into it and breaking it and setting off all these alarms. You have to get up very early and just be there and not impose your impact and just listen with no jumping in. And you can stay all day like that if you have your food ready. You can just sit and observe and see the forest acting in ways that it normally doesn't act. And it's important to do that at different times of day too, so you can observe a place at different seasons, at different times of day, at different moods. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to understand the full patterns of a place. So it's also essential in the same way to do that with groups and people. It's essential to check in with others, and you need repeat observations for instrumental reason, for that type of reason, where you're observing over and over again. Just because you see something once doesn't mean that it's actually a pattern, right? But I also want to bring in what's called communicative reason. So what did I say here? Has a different view from the experience of class, race, gender. So there's always these perspectives that are, if you have a repeating observation, you're going to have overrepresentation of majority or privileged views. If there's already something blocking the ability to get information out, if only a couple of voices are being broadcast louder, your sense of reality is going to be distorted through that majority rule or through that privilege rule. So it's actually, when you're doing communicative reason, you actually need to be seeking out the marginal and the unheard. And maybe not even seeking it out yourself, but allowing it to be present at the center of conversations. So people who have a different view from that experience in class, race, gender, life, etc. We need to listen to other observations, especially those whose observations get lost in the din of the majority. And we need to see patterns in time and space. We have to use parallax, right? Which is, we have two eyes in order to see depth, which opens up another dimension. And if we bring in two perspectives, we can often see something that neither perspective would be capable of. And we may, for a while, have this fight where we're like, wait, no, obviously my microphone is to the left of this water bottle. And you're like, well, I'm over here, and I see that it's to the right. And it's because there's actually distance between them, and there's spatiality that gets understood from two perspectives. So we must use parallax, seeing from different angles, times of day and year, context, levels of detail, zooming in and out. So please know that meaning making is often for later and gets in the way of observation. So really just looking out without interpretation, maybe even just with a meditative presence. Maybe you don't need to understand a thing yet. So Mollison is an example, and I'm quoting him a lot because these are the principles, but I get my inspiration from a lot of other people. Mollison said that the best tool for designers was a hammock. So you sit in the hammock and you let the day happen and you just absorb it. So in the same spirit, many choose a single spot to go to every day and just be, to see what birds are. Maybe we don't know what birds are. What plants are. Do we really know them? The sun and wind and bugs, what are they? And to clear away the media stories and just be with a place so often that you know it. So that's the principle today, this principle. So when you find yourself trying to solve things, design things, and act on them, maybe it's time for protracted and thoughtful observation rather than for thoughtless labor. Oh, here's what I wrote here. I said, I forgot, this is not just for landscaping design. I'm talking about these principles to be used in work, in your home, in family, in organizations, in community, in organizing a campaign or planning a road trip. So it says here, I actually did a thread a while ago with how do I observe a piece of land, and I might as well go to it and talk about that. Thanks again for everybody who's here. We have a nice group of people. Please feel free to write or ask questions. So, when observing a piece of land, I have an inner checklist I go through. At first, it's really just nice to look at the landscape without any judgment. Don't get pulled by inner thoughts. Just be. See things. Hear things. How do things smell? How do you perceive them? Walk and meander. And hold back all assessment. So then next I allow myself to think about the people who are in relationship with this land, good or bad, their goals, their problems to resolve. And usually I'll take small criteria that they've given me, like I want figs, or we want to do carbon sequestration, and I'll step back to the values behind it, which are, why does somebody want figs? Well, they want fruit, right? Why do they want fruit? Well, they want food, or they want habitat, or they want a market product, or they want food in the future. Like, people have all these different reasons. Maybe their grandfather had a fig tree and they missed their grandfather, and this is a way of honoring him. Well, that's a really different value. Ways of honoring your grandfather is different than I want figs, right? So these values could be taking care of people, staying safe, etc. And I also ask, what histories and inequities are at work here that might make important voices be absent? Is there a way for their goals to be present? And this is a really hard part of the work, because the whole process is in conflict with those deep goals of people care. When we're colonizers, we have to ask big questions about, like, well, wait a minute, why is my voice so important right here and right now? And if we are going to make this world better, if we're going to repair things, maybe it's important to feel uncomfortable and be separate from how easy it is to have our will exerted. So then we begin to move through different scales of permanence in the landscape, and starting with the broadest and deepest, which is climatic conditions. The averages and extremes of all the processes of light, heat, weather, biosphere inputs, the ranges of the streams, the deep soil formation, and changes to come. And climate's changing, so we have to look ahead and to the past. So with each of these scales, it's good to separate this what question, the observational assessment of the conditions of that scale, from the so what, the meaning of that observation, right? In light of the goals. So what is the climate? And so what in terms of the goals? So climate and the site has led to specific patterns of landform, the actual shape of the land. What are these patterns of ridges and valleys, of change of inflection on the landscape? Landscapes are shaped often like this, right? What are these key points, these curvature spots? And where do things collect on the landscape? What are the spots of change? And where do materials collect? So again, what does this have to do with the goals? That's the next question. Where can we move? Are slopes too steep for certain hopes? Are opportunities for living or things that might take a lot of work to find balance with, right? So like slope matters. You can't put a house in steep slopes. You can't be digging and tilling in certain slopes. Certain places are appropriate for terracing. Certain places are appropriate for swales. That so what question starts to come up. If there's an impenetrable cliff, that's a very different dynamic than a flat, easy landscape. How would the forces of slope and aspect, which is the relationship of landscape and its slope towards direction? Is it facing the sun? Is it away? Is it facing the wind? Is it away? How would the forces of slope and aspect relate to everything that started this search? So what is really the land's goals? So where the land's goals meet the people goals, we ask, is there a pattern that can help generate reconciliation and peace between these forces? Right? The land has patterns and the people have patterns. And there's got to be a resolution where those patterns work together, where they can make each other stronger. So we also move from what to so what to now what, which are the ideas for land and people cooperation. We don't decide on them, but we just note them. We're still in observation, right? This is an observational process. So then we go to the next scale, water. So the question is what? Land helps the water flow. It collects, it spreads, it converges, it infiltrates, it erodes. It forms pools and wetlands. It blows out check dams. It waters vegetation and animals. It evaporates before anyone can use it. It zooms off site without doing any ecological labor. So what about water? How do these patterns relate to the needs of people in the land? What are the hopes of the people to drink, cook, clean, irrigate? The ways water asserts itself when people want other things. How do these factors define a pattern of opportunity and challenge? Water goes where it will, and the land is shaped to how it's shaped. How does that work when we have certain goals? Are they always appropriate? If I look at a piece of landscape and somebody wants to put in like athletic space, right? If it's really wet in the north part of the property, it might not be the right place to put a soccer field, unless they're willing to do a number of other factors. So again, that relationship of wanting fitness on land or wanting to play soccer needs to be balanced with the needs of the landscape, how water moves, how it collects, its volume. So now what with water? Water can be slowed sometimes. Can it be stored, spread, held high on the land, reused, diverted before it adds to a flashy stream? Can it be spread out through the dry season? Can it be held safely in a pond or under a canopy of trees? Can a river be sinuous? Or can the land be swaled or oxbowed for salmon and lamprey? So then now what for water? Can we apply keyline principles, collecting water above the key points and spreading it below? Any good pond sites that can collect and move water or hold water until it needs a sprinkler to sprinkler a home in a fire. So one thing you can do is if you can store water high in elevation above a home, now it can be gravity fed. So if there's a massive fire, it can be dumped rapidly into a sprinkler system that just pours and empties onto the area right around a house so that the house can't catch fire. So where does extra water flow to? Does it go to a pond? Does it go to a forest? Does it go to the next watershed over? So water, all those things, they set this next category, which is access and circulation. What are the easy ways to move around? By foot, bike, car? How do you get around this place, this city? How do the animals move? Ridges happen to make for good paths and roads because they're less steep, less wet. They're often just more stable with the rock right under. What are the features that should be accessible? Are there places so much for the non-human that they should be inaccessible? Where does the puma get to rest? Places too wet to cross, or with a delicate species, or they're too treacherous. People don't have to go everywhere. We don't have to make access for people for everything. How will materials go in and out of the site? What are the linkages to the regional context of roads? Is there a natural pattern of movement that can be enhanced? And how do those patterns fit with all of these other goals? All above shape and scale of this vegetation and wildlife, what are the vegetation types? This is the vegetation question. Their patterns, their habitats, the problem species, grasses for pasture, trees. Are there a lot of young trees or just old ones? Is this a landscape in change? What animals live here, both the seen and the unseen? Old plants left over from other human uses. What are the birds bringing in and leaving by fence posts? There are plants from each layer of the forest, right? There's the canopy layer, and there's the low canopy, and the emergent trees that shoot up in gaps, and there's small trees, and shrubs, and forbs, and ground cover, and vines. Are there plants accumulating lots of biomass quickly? Are there plants that fix nitrogen of all the sizes? Are there poisonous plants that have function both for themselves, for medicine, and for protection? Or are they also a threat to some of our goals? So opportunities and challenges as these patterns are matched with the intention of the people. Are they compatible? Can existing veg work together with the people? Where might there need to be a pattern, a patchwork of different kinds of landscapes? Some intervention, some fire, some clearing, some new planting. Yeah. Within mentally, we can run the ecosystem forward and backwards. We can imagine time passing. We can say, what happens if this is left alone? What happens if this has a fire? What happens if we put seeds here? What happens if we clear here? And we run the system forward and backwards in our mind. So then on any landscape, I like to go down to the river or stream. And I talked about this in the last stream I did. So how's the river or stream doing? Is it have algae? Is it turbid? Is it clear? Look under stones. Are there caddisfly larvae? Is there a relationship to the floodplain, or is it trying to form a new floodplain because it's incised? Does the sun beat down, or is there shade? Is there wood in the stream, which is good, right? Wood helps create habitat. It helps slow down the energy of the stream. It adds structural diversity. Is this river incising, or does it have nick points that it's moving through? Is it moving gravel, which are the stones without vegetation stored nicely on the sides? Is it braided, multiple channels? Or is it a single channel? Or is it oxbowed? What footprints are in the mud? What vegetation grows in the riparian zone, in the wetlands? So then we look for life. Is there diversity of varieties of things, of species of things, of genera, of families, kingdoms, of different ecological niches, of lifestyles, of beings? What is their richness? Now look for bones, look for scat, look for gnawed vegetation, look for flowers, colors, sounds, smells, holes, gnats and dragonflies, perches, meals, larders. Somewhere in here, maybe bigger than access and circulation, are the legal, social, and economic factors. What's the ownership system at work? What are the rights of way? What are the laws that affect all of the smaller systems? What's the neighborhood? Ordinances, fees, electricity, restaurants, water rights, historical injustices, programs, grants, reconciliation processes, social movements. How do they work with or are in apparent conflict with goals? What patterns might lead to improved relationships or working with these systems? And then smaller than vegetation and animals, are there patterns of microclimate made by them? How does the wind move on this site? How is it directed and blocked by trees? How does light and heat collect with land? Cool and hot places, wet and dry places, light and dark places, loud and quiet places, frost. And you make little bubble diagrams of all these little spots. You make little circles, and you see this spot's a little cozy. This spot has a little muggy. This spot sits in the sun so long that it's warm and the land just gives off heat. There's rocks in this hillside so that it has a stable climate. It's right by the water, so it has mist in the morning, but then it's warm throughout the day, even in the winter. Which of these microclimates guide the goals, or which of the microclimates are in conflict with them? So how might they be strengthened or changed? All of this defines all of this stuff that we just talked about. It defines the next scale, which are buildings and infrastructure. And those only get thought about after you've thought about all those previous ones. And we're kind of moving in the ethics, right, from land to people. Inventory what's there and where it is, in conflict or in harmony with the other patterns. Safe home or exposed to the wind. Note the paving, the fences, the conditions, the utility, the wells, the greenhouses, and the interesting site locations. In light of these goals, of your goals, of the site goals, of the land goals, are these structures in harmony, or do they present challenges? What might be changed or enhanced? So a reminder that this assessment can be in cities and towns, anywhere. So all of these layers are present in New York City, or in the suburb, or in the wilderness. In a neighborhood, what is the pattern of buildings, the density, the quality, etc.? And within all of the above, there's these zones of use. How has it been used so far, and how do neighbors and the public use it? How is it set up for use right now? And then, given where house and barn and shed and greenhouse and apartment is or could be, what would be a more natural pattern of use? So all of these systems, every single one of these systems, defines where soil forms, where it can form. So what is the soil now? What is its structure, its pH? Is it agriculture or forest? Is it grassland? How is the rhizosphere? How are the roots, the organic matter? Go dig a hole and look at it. I smell soil, right? I smell it. I want to know what the processes are. I want to look at its color and its shape and its texture. Is it wetland soil, which has gray areas often, or is like extremely black, not fertile black, but like black with like rotting organic matter, just like undecomposed in it? Or does it have little red flecks of concretions where iron has like collected and then dried and turned into iron oxide again? Muck, how's its fertility? How's its toxics? How toxic is this soil? What's been its management? And what soils are needed for the goals, for plant communities, for the support of people, for the support of roads and buildings, for the support of animals? And what can be done? You can subsoil, you can add water, you can drain, you can irrigate, you can add vegetation, you can do holistic grazing, you can do compost and coppice and chop and drop where you cut back vegetation over and over again. So what biomass is around? If you look around, what could become soil? You know, walking in the city, what's that shrub that's right there? Can you cut it down a little bit, bring it, prune it and turn that into soil? Are there weeds that could be piled up into a compost pile? Is there food accumulating in a dumpster that could be turned into a compost pile? There's so much organic matter everywhere. And this is also, just to take a note, this is why the project's called BuildSoil, because BuildSoil is sort of the beginning and the end. It's one of the ways that we begin a process of changing the world directly. But it's also a rubric or measurement for the successes of social, ecological, cultural processes. A culture that works well together, that takes care of each other, that takes care of people, that takes care of injustice, is a world where soil will improve over time. And so any moment, our soil is struggling to grow and live, right? And we need to return back to the social and the economic and the cultural and the legal, and the family and the cooperation and the neighborhood, in order to make sure that soil building happens. So now we've come to this most superficial of layers, the aesthetic and the experienced, which I don't mean this in terms of superficial like it's non-existent, but it's icing. It's the final. So it's all defined by those that are there. So a proper aesthetics is one where there's a match between all of those systems and then the final creation of it. So how was the arrival into this location? Where can you see views? Are there good views? Are there bad views? What's public and what's private? Does this feel cozy? Does this feel safe? How navigable and legible is it? What's indoor versus outdoor? Do outdoor spaces feel like places, or do they feel like dead zones? Are there spaces where one can be protected while looking over something, which is called prospect refuge? It's the most essential place for humans to feel safe, is to have your back protected and you're sheltered, but you're looking out onto something vast. That's where human beings feel the most safe in most environments. So if you have a vast area, is there somewhere safe to be on its edge? And again, all of this stuff, how does it relate back to these goals for how people should feel, or for who is welcome, or for how things are shown or make meaningful, or if people can find their way on their own? So with all these different patterns, we then look at the what, so what, now what for each layer. We put them all in the same summary analysis map, summarizing all of these analyses. And we ask, what is this overall pattern of conflict and opportunity? What's key? We simplify all of these questions after we've done each of these layers, and we say, what is the overall pattern of conflict and relationship and opportunity, and what's in agreement between all of the different forces, and what's struggling? And if you can understand that pattern, this sets the stage for design. Design can only happen when you have that perspective. Just to give some context, where does this process I just described come from? Well, I'm reciting this from memory, but I didn't invent it. I learned it partially from permaculture. The scales of permanence come first from Percival Yeomans, but a lot of there's a lot of cultures that use similar concepts, but I got the version I just went through from David Jackie, who's a designer. Dave and I both went to the Conway School of Landscape Design, which is where I have my master's degree. But I was taught much of this by Ken Byrne, Donald Walker, Paul Hellman, and Walter Kanahosky. These techniques are the basis of GIS as well, but they were rooted and developed by the great landscape architect Ian McHarg, and they're rooted in the principles of ecology. And I've learned from many other traditions, teachers, practices, approaches, and from the land itself, just from like being out there and seeing how it works over time. The most important thing is to use the time and spatial scales of the system to organize observation and to separate observation from analysis and from design directives and to be able to bring it all together. So I have this on the Twitter because I want people to have a blueprint for thinking about observation. And this is specifically was one about landscape design, right? But the truth is that this methodology, this approach can be applied to all sorts of relationships. I think I often forget to apply this when I'm dealing with friends or loved ones, which is literally, am I really being present? Am I really observing? And I do think that observation is the first principle for trying to act in any way ethically. How can we be ethical if we can't see what we're doing, or if we can't feel what we're doing, or we can't find some way of navigating, some way of moving through? Otherwise, you're just imposing your own world onto the world. And how many voices are you silencing? So that's where I wanted to start. Where are we right now? We're about an hour in. I think I'll read one more of these threads. And I'm grateful for everyone who's here. Please say hi, anyone who feels like it. And if you haven't already, please connect with the project if you like, or connect with our Twitter, or connect with our Discord. And there's lots of people who are working together on trying to make something more interesting happen. I hope that this is useful for people. I'm also going to just keep trying things on this stream. I'm not attached to any particular way of doing things. So if people feel that this time could be better used in another way, I'm hoping to do some more specific lessons on chestnut production and lessons on soil building. And we're going to be making some videos outside this spring, some instructional videos to put on our website. Oh, Joel has a comment. I don't know if you brought this up on another stream, but I thought of one of the questions you asked a long time ago, which was walk out your front door and where do you see soil in creation? Yeah, so I think that's a great exercise. So, tomorrow, next day, what's the first soil that you see when you walk out the house? Is it moss that's just like been there for a while on the sidewalk? Is it a pile of leaves that didn't get removed this fall and it's now turning into leaf mold, which is like the best soil for vegetables? Is there just like a little plot of grass where the grass is like dealing with compaction, but it's like trying its best and slowly it's building up organic matter? That's a great place to start. So let's see what else I was thinking about. I had a bunch of things I wanted to sort of talk about. I'm going to do one of these threads that's a little bit more visual. Let's talk about edge. This is actually my 12th day of that process when I was teaching this stuff. But I think this is a fun one. So, elements in any system. So what's a system, right? A system is like things that have relationships with each other in kind of a network, right? Right now I've got a little system going. There's like me and this microphone and this computer. Oh, hey, it's Permybird. Thanks for joining. I'm just doing permaculture principles for the last hour and next maybe 40 minutes. So we're in a system right now, right? There's a camera and I'm constantly looking at the camera and adjusting my position. So if I get over here too much, if I get over here too much, I have a system that is like letting me know feedback and I sit back in the right position, right? If I move too much and the camera gets out of focus, I reach up here and I push on the screen and it refocuses it. There's a system of people who are feeding back and looking. But a system can be as simple as a faucet in your hand and a water tank, and you want the right temperature of water. So you keep turning and adjusting the system until it regulates, until it creates the water temperature you want. You start to run out of warm water, you turn the cold down and the warm up. Right? So that's a system. Systems don't have to be too complicated, but they can also be incredibly complicated. So elements in any system are the confluence of all of their needs and all of their actions. Behind us is all of this stuff that we're needing, right? Where we have, trying to think about it. We need water, we need shelter, we need quietness, we need others. And we also create things, right? We create ideas and communication, we create waste, we create garbage. We need entertainment, but we also create piles of boxes from stuff that we have delivered. We crave food, but we also create a lot of the waste, the skins of oranges, all this stuff, right? So there's inputs and outputs. We want things to be self-improving. We want to optimize connections. Oh, nice. This is one of my favorites. I think this is when I learned how important visuals are for these kinds of threads. I actually learned a lot doing these threads. So here's a permaculture principle, which is use edges. Use edges. Edges are everywhere. So here's an image I picked of a type of edge. This is called the dragon curve. It's a fractal, where literally I think you can make this fractal by you literally take a thing and you fold it, and then you fold it again, and that's the first one in that image. And then it gets folded again and again and again. And if you were to take a piece of paper and fold it again and again and again like this, it would eventually become this curve, this area of just so much edge. The only thing is, the amount of size would get smaller and smaller as it crinkled. So you'd have to get a bigger and bigger piece of paper to make a more crinkled object the same size. We just need a big piece of paper? What do you mean, Joel? So when we look at landscapes, the same thing's happening. You can look at this edge. Where does the water begin? Oh yeah. Where does the water begin? Where does the land end? In this case, this is not just a simple straight line, this coastline, right? It is folds and folds and folds, and they have the quality of being somewhat self-similar. There's large, cuts, and then there's little bumps on the bumps, and there's little tinier bumps on the bumps on the bumps. And each of these are new opportunities for places for organisms that like to live on the edges, that take advantage of land and water. So today's I guess I was busy that day. What we need is a way of understanding the world that helps us know how to help improve opportunities and niches for everyone, including all of the other species. And that's based in observation, which we talked about here, and another permaculture principle, which is work with nature rather than against. Why not work with the natural way that things work? Because they're already being done on their own that way. We don't have to do everything. So as we really go look at the world, we often take for granted that it is heterogeneous. It's lumpy. It's made of clumps. There are stars clumped together. There are planets. There are continents. There are oceans. There are air masses, solid things, molten things, clumps of vegetation and clearings, cliques of people, not evenly spread out. So here we go. Here's the Earth. Here's the solar system, the outer system, the closest stars, the Milky Way, the clumps of galaxies, and the way that those clumps are clumped. Things are clumpy. They are not exactly the same. You don't just see stars at every scale. Galaxies are not arranged exactly the same way stars are arranged. Events happen. All events in the world. Oh, sorry, I'm having trouble getting this thing to... Here we go. Events happen because of differences in media. So what's an event? This is like a big question, right? How do things happen in the world? Things happen at the edge between different media. You have a difference in temperature. Now the wind will blow. You have the beginning of a perfectly spherical organism that has a little tiny nick point. And it's at that nick point that then it folds in on itself and begins to make the tube that creates an organism. Events happen because of some sort of difference. And then those differences cause more differences. Diffusion of ions across a membrane helps you think and move. Trees collect light and use that light to collect and mix land and air. Winds move because of differences in temperature and pressure. The edge between things is where there's the possibilities offered by both. So wetlands, estuaries, forest edges, parties with a lot of different kinds of people, a bookstore with a cafe, two things, right? These are all more than they were before because of that overlap. In ecology, these are called ecotones. So here's some nice images. Here we have 3 species that live in habitat A and 3 species that live in habitat B, but we might find that 9 kinds of species will live in both. You have the species that live in one and the other, and ones that only live in that only live in that middle space. And so edges create more opportunity than you would ever have if there was less edge. The more edge there is, the more complex that edge is, the more opportunity there is for that kind of space and that kind of convergence. Oh, well, this will be posted on our YouTube, so you're welcome. Thanks for stopping by, though. So here's an example of a forest and a grassland and the zone between. There are certain opportunities that are offered by the edge between a forest and a grassland. There's organisms that live in both. Deer and cows both really love living protected by trees, and they love being able to move out and get into the grasslands. There's safety offered by the forest, but there's different kinds of food and opportunity in the grassland, and the edge between becomes this interesting space for both. Here's a land ecosystem and aquatic ecosystem, and then the space between. This is the space that amphibians live in a lot of the time because they get the opportunities of land and water. And land animals can come down to the water, and water animals can get close up to the land. The biodiversity, the complexity, the opportunity to have both air and water and soil, to have aquatic soils and hydric soils right next to upland soils and aerobic soils. There's all of these interesting spaces that are not offered in either. Excuse me. Oh, here's a quote from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So we all like to congregate at boundary conditions, where land meets water, where earth meets air, where body meets mind, where space meets time. We like to be on one side and look at the other. And this is referring to how beach houses are really great. I mean, Douglas Adams wrote this. So landscape architects have a term for an idealized human habitat, which is called prospect refuge. It's the refuge that you can see from. It's protected in the forest, looking out at a clearing or savanna. We feel safe, we can see out, we are hidden, but the world is observable. So here's some landscape architect images of what prospect refuge might look like. We love this space. And even if you I recommend noticing prospect refuges because they are great. And if you can ever enhance or improve a prospect refuge, just a cozy little spot where you're protected but look out through something. I've also noticed that a lot of Kurosawa movies are filmed from a prospect refuge looking out at a vast situation. You'll see the moving reeds in the foreground, and you'll see the action happening in the mid and the vastness behind. Also, please, folks, this is an open conversation. If anybody has anything to say, please join the chat. Boundaries can be between characteristics like hot and cold, acid and base, paved and porous, elderly and young, science and art, day and night. And those differences set up stresses. They have different situations. So pattern in nature is the resolution of stress. And I might need to do a much more detailed pattern talk because this can only hint at where pattern goes. Either pattern in nature, like when you see pattern, things that are replicated over time, whether they're from a pattern to an example, they're either a physical expression like mountains buckling or clay cracking, right? Or evolution has worked out a way to utilize edge and direct that energy to create opportunity. So let's look at these two patterns right here. We have a cracking pattern in clay. So the clay has actually was full of water and was pretty uniform, but then as it dried, it shrank. And instead of uniformly just turning into dust, it actually clumped, right? It clumped at a certain scale. And it's interesting because you can look at this clump and it forms a fractal. There's a clump here, and it's part of a larger clump here. And that's part of like a bigger clump here. There's a pattern to the pattern. And if you look here at these trees, they're doing the same thing, right? They've branched up. They're trying to reach the most area they can, but they have crown shyness. And so that they have formed almost the same pattern. You can draw a line around this clump of clumps, and you can draw a line around these clumps. So this is not a mistake, right? Let me draw something really quick. Both of these systems are actually doing the exact same thing, which is that if you were to cut, if you were to cut these horizontal against the ground somehow, if you were able to like cut a slice and look at it, you'd see the same pattern. You'd see something like this, or actually more accurately for the trees, something like this for each tree. This is happening in the clay too. So what this is describing is optimal stacking and optimal packing. There are lines of tension in that clay that actually resemble the branching patterns of the tree. The forces that allow the tree to grow out and also collect are the same things that are holding the clay in its formation, right? And so as the clay has had to pull back, that is the structure, the same pattern as the branching patterns of trees in a forest. And so in one example, the tension of those stresses, the shrinking of the material, and the need for clay to bond for itself has formed the exact same pattern as the trees need to optimize its expansion and also its collection. And getting a handle on this is interesting because this pattern shows up everywhere. It turns out that most patterns in nature actually are this pattern at some scale and or some orientation in space and time. Some process of collection and expansion. So, some plants and animals grow on land and some in ponds, but at the edge there's an opportunity for both, plus the wetland plants and the amphibious animals. We can work with edge by increasing it. If we need a 1 hectare pond and a 4 hectare field, but want blueberries, so we want a 1 hectare acre, right? Or it's a different measurement, but a unit of space. And we want a 4 hectare field, but we want blueberries, which, like the pond edge, we can double the amount of edge with a curvy margin to double the amount of blueberries that can be grown with the same area of land and water. So here's a regular pond. It has 1 hectare, and here's an area that is 4 hectares of a field. This is the same size 5 hectare unit of land. No change in pond size, no change in field size, but we've doubled the amount of edge just by making it wavy. And so if you actually did a check mark and you said, okay, a blueberry can exist every so many feet along the edge of a pond, well, we've actually doubled the amount of blueberries that can exist here. The pond itself has a slightly different shape, but it also then offers refugia and opportunities for the fish, and they can also get the advantage of organic matter. Just by making the edge wavy, by crenulating it, we've doubled the amount of edge and kept the other units the same, which means we've doubled the amount of blueberries that can go into that space. Another image of the same idea. 32 plants versus 64 plants. So fractals tell us that the amount of edge can approach infinity, but this has obvious limits, of course. An infinite edge of a pond is really just a wettish zone around it. We are looking to edge within practical reason. We don't have to make infinite edge because honestly, reality is already there. So we just start by suggesting edge, by creating edge at the scale that we're interested in, and we begin to create harmonics, literally like the relationships between things that happen at the flows and rates, because nature has to constantly be adjusting loads, and it does adjust loads, the amount of labor that one system does as it exerts and makes transformation in another system. that has to have the most space between them. I mean, like a good example is your lungs. We need to get a lot of oxygen, but our bodies are only so big. So our lungs have created fractal edges so that the most possible stacking of the cells that you may take advantage of air and feed it into blood vessels are optimized, right? If we just had perfectly round lungs, there's only so much surface area to the lung itself. But you make that fractal pattern, that undulation, and now the amount of gas exchange that can happen between our blood and the air is effectively, grown massively. So anytime we can increase edge, we can improve the rate at which one system can transfer to another. So when you understand this, you start to wonder why we make everything straight. Many cities are grids, the result of centuriation. This is the Roman colonial grid, and it was set up by the Roman army for the control of the population. So a lot of cities, especially in North America and the West, were modeled by the National Land Ordinance for a rapid-fire colonization effort, right? And old cities, they follow land, they follow natural patterns. They can still be colonial, but they have a very different structure than these like rigid grid cities. Grid cities don't have a lot of room for hanging out, and that was on purpose. The Roman centuria, the military, would go to places, find the crossroads, and build grids for people to be in. And those grids were clearly easy to police, they were easy to administer, and they did not have unapproved public gathering spaces at the crossroads. The moment that things started to fall apart is when you see those cities being abandoned and people creating the beautiful cities like in Italy now, which are random in their form, follow the shape of the land, and have many places to gather and have quiet, private conversations. So, reducing edge is actually a form of control and a way to do things as well. If we want the effects of biodiversity between plants, but still want to be able to harvest one or two crops, we can start to introduce curves. So rather than having a true, like perfect polyculture where everything is just sort of random, sometimes that doesn't work very well. We want to actually like harvest chestnuts in a row. So you can take advantage of that where plants here have a lot of, a certain amount of edge between each other, but their relationships are a certain amount. There's a certain kind of effect between different species. But if you can improve the edge, you can then optimize and increase the amount of connection between those things. More plants can fit into the same area in ways that are always adjacent and connected to other plants. So there can be a compromise. This could be made into the ultimate fractal, and then at some point it's just the same as throwing seed. And in my gardens, a lot of the time, I've just decided that infinite edge is fine, and I'll just throw seed out randomly. But if you want to do something a little more orderly, and sometimes you need to, right? Sometimes you want to do things in a patchy structure. You want to pull up plants all at once. All the beets you pull up, you want to put something else underneath. You want that to be a rotation. You want to be able to do weed control. You want an area that's safe for the chickens to walk in and areas that aren't safe for the chickens. You might want to not have infinite edge. You might want to have finite edge, but you get to choose how much that is. How much exchange do you want between the chicken coop and the chicken run and the garden? So let's take an example from evolution. So imagine you're a plant and you have cells that you use for sunlight to collect for carbon and food. And you have a vascular system that needs to collect that food. It needs to supply nutrients, but it doesn't photosynthesize. So like you literally have the veins of a leaf, right? So in a leaf, the cells can collect sunlight and the veins can't do very much with sunlight because their job is moving materials. So you've got a bunch of tubes or highways or roads that you can't do anything on, and then you want to optimize the amount of growing area. So you need to grow the most. You want the smallest amount of collection area, but you want every single cell to be able to be accessed. So the answer is the branching patterns of leaves. Veins are minimized, access is complete, growing area is maximized. So we can look at different ways that leaves have arranged themselves. They're optimizing the collection of every single cell is reached. But these are better patterns than if you had like a perfect grid over the whole thing. Now, different plants have made different evolutionary paths based on whether they actually need, what's more important in their context. They have different biologies, they have different bodies, they have different heights, they have different climatic conditions. And so they've had to come up with different patterns to deal with that. But we say that there's these main roads. A leaf is not just a ton of big main roads. It's one main road and some little roads off of that and tinier roads off of that and tinier little collection, like corridors off of that. So this fractal pattern optimizes edge for this plant. Well, all that edge allows for the exchange of gas, minerals, flows, water. And it's all accordion folded up into that compact space. So this is the thing I think is interesting. We may find another thing in the world that has a similar pattern. And so when I'm designing a garden, right, I have a similar set of forces. Wherever we walk, like the path, I literally can't grow that much, right? I can have a little clover, I can have a little bit of thyme. But the truth is that paths are not great garden spaces. But I need to be able to get to every part of the garden, right? Because if I don't get to every part of the garden and I have to like step, eventually I'm sort of turning it into a path. I'm compacting soil. So I'm adding more path effectively, right? So I need to be able to access the whole garden. I want to grow as much as possible in a finite area. I don't want to take up too much area with paths. So we can do the exact same thing. We can look to a leaf to design our garden. This is a little like extreme, but imagine a garden or a forest where the paths follow the same pattern that a leaf would. And in the smaller beds, we can do the same thing with what we call a keyhole bed. We just have to find a path to the center and not slice it up into sections. So here's a garden where we've just created even paths and there's a garden bed between. This is a very traditional way of doing gardening. And it might be good for some context. But we might decide that we can clump them together and use less path. Well, that's good too. This might be exactly the size of like 3 feet so that we can reach to the other side of the path. Without having to like add an additional path. So then the other thing we could do is we could curve it around so that we're using half the path, but the garden is accessible all around us. So this is sort of like a mini leaf. This is basically like the tiniest unit of what a leaf would look like if you went down and looked at the smallest bit of how that photosynthetic structure is being collected. Sugars are moving out of it, nutrients are moving into it, water's moving into it to optimize exchange. And those can be set together in yet another branching pattern of branches. So here's a little keyhole bed. Here's a bunch of keyhole beds, and they're folded together to minimize path, maximize growing area, and maximize access. The patterns of plants over evolutionary time can be a pattern for us to think about how we would design another kind of space. This might be true for a kitchen or a neighborhood as well. Now, you don't want to just do this blindly. You want to understand the reasons and rationale for a pattern. And then you can take advantage of that pattern when the forces of tension are applied. I talked about that before when we were talking about observation of landscapes, where eventually our job is to understand where are things working with each other and where are they opposed. And pattern is the resolution of conflict. So we can look at the pattern of conflict and look at other examples where there's similar patterns of conflict and apply the pattern of resolution of that conflict. So here's some examples of perennial edible sun traps. Mini leaves, basically, aimed to collect from the sun. South-facing in the north and north-facing in the south. If you zoomed in on those paths, you'd see the edges had edges too, like the tiny wavy bumps along your intestinal lining. We can have those in our gardens, and the way buildings are arranged along a street can be the same. So here's like the edge of your intestine, which is increased edge to allow for the transformation, the movement of food into your body, at much more than if you just had like a smooth intestinal lining. How would I define tension in this sense? Well, there's literally a conflict going on, right? If I want to grow as much food as possible, and I'm trying to be able to harvest and connect and weed with every plant, those are in tension with each other. Like, I could just take my garden and plant the whole thing, and I literally can't get out there anymore. which means that it would get wild and I wouldn't notice the bugs that take over the corn. And I, it would be hard to harvest something. What if something in the middle of the garden needs attention, but it's everything on the outside is too delicate? So there, we do need paths to be able to get in there. And the first rule for me of soil building is actually like design your paths and stick to them, because worms will take care of soil. Soil microbes will start fluffing the soil over time. The plants will do the job of building it. So if you leave a piece of land alone and just literally just build a path that's clear where you're supposed to walk and keep off the grass, eventually you're going to improve the soil in that place. And at the same time, we can't grow on the paths, right? So the path can't be a growing area, but it needs to be everywhere touching the growing areas. So the pattern of the branching pattern is the way that it's resolving that conflict between those needs. And same thing's true for people. You may have an upstairs neighbor who makes a ton of noise because their job is, that they're a dance instructor, or they have to practice dancing, and you happen to work nights, and so you have to be awake at night. Our boundaries always tension. Boundaries always can have tension, but they tend to resolve that tension through finding the right amount of edge, is what I would say. Is that their boundaries by definition are one system next to another system, but they can be arranged, right? So It's a good question. I think I would say that this is almost universally true, right? So the places where you don't have tension are the places where it's been worked out over time. Like when you have good boundaries with somebody, let's say like you and your best friend know each other so well that one person's anxious attachment style could, and like their need for you might get in the way of the way that you heal. And so if you've really been able to work through stuff, you've learned when to talk to each other, what to say, how to work. You've come up with like routines and patterns and understanding. And now there's no longer tension. Now there's the opportunities of edge. So it's both tension and opportunity, right? Somebody who says paths are an opportunity to build soil by taking down woody debris and using the gardener to break them down. Right. So the access of the gardener is actually essential, just like the photosynthetic cells of the leaf need water. They need somebody to collect the sugar. They need that process of the vascular tissue of the plant. Without the paths in the leaf, they would build up. There would be pollution. There'd be just too much sugar in one spot. There wouldn't be enough clean water to do photosynthesis. The flow between these media is mediated by the resolution of these things. Yeah, exactly. So I'm not saying that like boundaries are bad. I'm actually saying the opposite. I'm saying that they are a dance, that we need to learn how to work with them. What is a healthy boundary? What is a safe boundary? What is a strong boundary? What is a porous boundary? What gets let in, what doesn't get let in? All those questions are questions that we ask when we're asking these things. And here's an example of a design of least path for home gardens. Here's a path with little keyhole beds off of it. And here's an example of a forest opening where the edge has been cringulated, so there's more edge than there would be if this was just a big, oval or something. And here's an example from Christopher Alexander's work of a bunch of houses that are long and thin along a path. But they can be crinkled so that the homes themselves have more edge and variation. And now there's little public squares and places to sit, and places to set up a little cafe, and spaces to watch the world go by. Spaces for shade, spaces for sun. Same amount of area, but all of these new opportunities. Here's a pattern from pattern language. Along promenades, in squares and evening centers, make a slightly raised platform to form a bandstand where street musicians and local bands can play. Cover it and perhaps build it in the ground level a tiny stalls for refreshments. Surround the bandstand with paved surfaces for dancing. No admission charge. So you place the bandstand in a pocket of activity towards the edge of a square or promenade. You make it a room defined by trellises and columns, a public outdoor room. You build food stands around the bandstands and for dancing, maybe color canvas canopies, which reach out over portions of the street and make the street and parts of it into a great half-open tent. So what was originally just a road and a place now becomes a connection between multiple forces and increased edge. And some more patterns from Christopher Alexander. I love him. Conceive of a house for one person as a place of utmost simplicity, essentially a one-room cottage or studio with a large or small alcoves. When it's the most intense, the entire house may be more than 300 or 400 square feet. So in the simplest form, Christopher Alexander, the architect, thinks of a house as a big room with a bunch of alcoves for sleeping or working or being private. And this offers privacy in a space that normally wouldn't. It offers many kinds of function to interplay with each other. It creates some degree of organization, but ultimately it creates a huge amount of edge. In any institution whose departments provide public service, make each service or department autonomous as far as possible. Allow no one service more than 12 staff members total. House in each one of these identifiable piece of a building. Give each one a direct access to a public thoroughfare. So in his imagination, if you have multiple departments, they need to have connections, like a leaf, or like leaves on a branch, or the same kind of pattern of stacking and edge. Here's him laying out a building. The main entrance, minor entrances, big realms, little realms, and tinier realms on each. Or a pedestrian street, where the street has been thickened by all of these arcades and buildings and interesting things on the edge. So it's not just a straight line, but it becomes an incredible amount of relationship building and almost like the lobes on your intestine. And then one more from him because he's so great. Here is a path that has been widened and crinkled. Make a bulge in the middle of a public path and make the ends narrower so that the path forms an enclosure, which is a place to stay and not just a place to pass through. So increasing edge and patterning the edge allows for this to be so much more than it would just be if it was just a regular road. The life of a public square forms naturally around its edge. If the edge fails, then the space never becomes lively. So you could have imagine like a gigantic public square that people all go into. Well, if there's only a simple edge, it's very hard to occupy that space if it's only a few people. Right? So you hang out in this gigantic public square and it's just like you and you're exposed. It might feel really amazing if 1,000 people were there, but if it's just you, it's like it's too much. But if you have a crinkled edge, a little cozy spot on the edge for yourself, or a little bit bigger area for a conversation for 3 people, or an even larger area for a group of 10 or 20, all on the edge of the big square, then the square is adaptable to different scales. In a house, keep passages short. Make them as much like rooms as possible, with carpets or wood on the floor, furniture, bookshelves, beautiful windows. Make them generous in shape and always give them plenty of light. The best corridors and passages are all of those which have windows along an entire wall. So form edges and alliances across human difference. A lot happened in my community in Portland in the 90s just by different groups spending time in spaces together, inviting each other to their events, chilling at a system of weekly underground cafes, activists, planners, punks, artists, politicians, musicians, people who are very different from each other, finding each other over and over again, creates something very different than people who are all the same. Fortunately, a lot of times in the internet, we have search criteria and we have algorithms and we get put with things that are identical. And so we don't have the opportunity for edges. We get put with the things that are similar. It's useful if you're trying to search for something, but it doesn't necessarily allow for surprise. So those are some thoughts on edge effect. And I may do one other talk before I go. We're at 1:30. I think there's one other thing I'd like to talk about if people are into it, but I would like to give a moment if anybody has any thoughts or questions. Really grateful for everyone who's here today. Yeah, I think I'll do one more. Actually, you know what? I think I'm going to save this for another time. I'm starting to get a little bit tired, and I think this is a big idea that I want to explore next. So I just want to say gratitude for everybody who has come by and has listened to this, and we're going to do another fun one, I think, next week, focused on fractal patterns and that kind of thing. If anybody has any questions or thoughts, please, feel free to DM me on Twitter at BuildSoil, or check out our YouTube posting of these at BuildSoil, and you can always ask questions or put things in there as well. And hope everybody's having a good night and stay safe, and see you all again later.